Meditation is a universal spiritual wisdom. We find it in all the great religious traditions, and of course it belongs within the Christian tradition as well. We call it contemplation, we call it the prayer of the heart. In the way most of us were introduced to prayer, we were introduced to mental prayer or devotional prayer, or perhaps the prayer of the sacraments, the Mass, and so on. And these are all very valid and helpful ways of prayer. But there's another dimension of prayer which we call the prayer of the heart. In these other forms of prayer, where we're using words and thoughts or imagination or rituals, we are still, to some degree, still at the level of the mind. But in meditation, we move from the mind to the heart by letting go of thoughts. This tradition in Christianity goes back, I think, to the teaching of Jesus himself on prayer. He tells us, when you pray, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in that secret place. So he stresses the importance of interiority, the heart. And then he tells us, when you pray, do not go babbling on like the heathen, who think the more they say, the more likely they are to be heard, because God knows your needs before you ask. So here he's telling us that we don't need to speak all the time. We don't need to use too many words. We can trust that God knows us and our needs are held in God's love. So here we can see a teaching on silence and on the value of silence. Then he tells us, do not worry. Lay aside your anxieties, your worries, he says. Look at the birds of the air, the lilies of the field, and contemplate the beauty of nature rather than just be constantly worrying about what we don't have. And I think here this is a challenging teaching on prayer, because he's asking us to lay aside the very things that our minds are usually preoccupied with. That's our thoughts of the past, our thoughts of the future, our anxieties, our fears, or our desires. But again, the teaching is very clear. Then he tells us, be mindful. Set your mind on God's kingdom before everything else, and everything else will come to you as well. Mindfulness means attention, paying attention, that specific attention of the heart, which really is the essence of all prayer. And finally, in this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us to live in the present moment. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't be living in tomorrow. Live now. And if you put all of these elements of Jesus' teaching on prayer together, you have a teaching on contemplation. And I think it's very clear. Jesus is a teacher of contemplation. When he speaks about prayer, he doesn't speak about rules and regulations or complex methods of prayer. He gives us these essential principles. They point to interiority, to silence, to freedom from worry, to a calm mind, to attention, and to being in the present moment, to contemplation. So Christian meditation is grounded, is rooted in the teaching of Jesus himself on prayer. Now we have a long tradition after the Gospel in which the great teachers of prayer in our mystical tradition have explored how we can put this teaching into practice. And the first ones to do this in a very clear and simple way were the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the early Christian monks from the 4th century. And they recommended a very simple method of meditation. They called it pure prayer. And they recommended that you take a single word or a short phrase and repeat this word or phrase continually in the mind and heart during the time of the meditation, letting go, they said, of all the riches of thought and imagination, and coming directly into poverty of spirit, by letting go of our thoughts, our plans, our memories, and so on. So this is essentially the teaching on prayer that we give today, and it's similar to the Jesus prayer, the hesychast form of prayer in the Orthodox Church. So this is the teaching. There's been a great hunger for this contemplative dimension of prayer in the modern church, and indeed in the modern world. And for various reasons that we won't go into at the moment, but for various reasons, this contemplative dimension of Christian life and of Christian prayer became marginalized over the centuries. And we came to think that it was only specialists, monks or nuns, who were able to experience this contemplative dimension. But since the Second Vatican Council, there's been a great recovery of the central importance of contemplation in the life of every Christian. Even in the Council's document on liturgy, it says the purpose of the liturgy is to develop a contemplative orientation in the people of God. So that's why we go to church, in fact, is so that we can live in this contemplative spirit. Thomas Aquinas said that contemplation is the simple enjoyment of the truth. Nothing could be more simple than that. Over the years, in recent years, our community, the World Community for Christian Meditation, has been working with many dioceses, Catholic dioceses around the world, introducing meditation to children in the Catholic school system. And it's been a wonderful discovery to find that we are born contemplative, that children have this innate contemplative capacity, and that we should be recognizing that and training that, developing it, right from the beginning of their religious formation, their spiritual education. So we have many schools now where meditation is an integral part of the life of the school, and it's giving a treasure, really, a life skill and a spiritual treasure to children which will remain with them for the rest of their lives. There are many people today, of course, who are looking for healing, people who are recovering from addiction, alcohol or drugs, people who are in depression. And we know from medical and scientific research that meditation, even practiced as just a secular technique, brings psychological and physical benefits. It lowers the blood pressure, it boosts your immune system, it improves your cholesterol, it helps you deal with depression or chronic pain, and so on, anxiety attacks. And these psychological or physical benefits of meditation, when we look at them in the light of the spiritual tradition, we can say these are examples of grace working on nature, that our human nature, which is psychological and physical as well as spiritual, will express in these beneficial ways the result of prayer, of deep prayer. Now, however, when we teach meditation in our community, we teach it primarily focused upon the spiritual fruits. And St. Paul says that these spiritual fruits are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, fidelity, gentleness, and self-control. So you have the benefits on the one hand, but you have the spiritual fruits, which of course give us a much deeper experience of the meaning of prayer and of our relationship to God. One of the great discoveries, I think, of our time is that meditation creates community. This was an insight of John Main, the founder and inspiration of the World Community. And this really opens up for us a mystery of Christ, that when we come together in his name, where 2 or 3 are gathered, he is present in a special way. So we have meditation groups forming all over Poland, in fact all over the world. And these small meditation groups meet every week. They meet in churches, in people's homes, in schools, in places of work, in hospitals, universities, which meets quietly to share the teaching, to maybe listen to a talk or read something from the contemplative tradition, and then, most important, to meditate together for about 20 or 30 minutes together in silence. And then after the meditation, there's an opportunity for questions or discussion. And this small weekly meditation group, I think, is one of the best ways that we can share the gift of meditation with people. And it's a very wonderful way of renewing the contemplative life of the church from the grassroots. So these meditation groups form quite naturally, and they form into local communities and national communities. And here at the moment we're having a Medytatio event, which is the annual Polish Christian meditation conference. We have meditators from all over the country, some from outside of the country, who come here to celebrate their community, to reflect upon how we can share the gift of meditation more widely with others, to be enriched by talks and by, above all, by meditating together. So it's a time of community, a time of learning, a time of reflection. And these annual conferences are very important stimulus for this work of teaching meditation. And of course there are also people here who are quite new to meditation. They've been brought by a friend, or they've heard about it from somebody else. And many people today, I think, at all levels of faith and in all walks of life, are seeking a deeper spiritual meaning, a deeper spiritual practice in life. And we have to be able to respond to that need, and we have to be there, we have to let people see that we're there, and then people come, and if they find what they're looking for, we can help them to go deeper. The real purpose of the weekly group or of a national conference like this is so that each of the members can go back home, back to their daily practice. We recommend people to meditate every day, morning and evening, and coming together like this periodically reinforces that simple daily discipline. And people sometimes ask, what happens in meditation? Well, in one sense, nothing happens. We're not looking for any dramatic experience in the meditation period. But of course people meditate because they feel that something is changing in their life, that a deep transformation, a liberation of their spirit, a freedom from fear, and an expanded capacity for life and for love is developing in them. That's why we continue to meditate. And so that daily meditation does need to be reinforced. It takes people time, of course, to build that discipline into their daily lives. But it's a powerful and enriching simplicity. The important thing, I think, always to remember with meditation is that it is a simple way. We can write books, we can give talks, we can have conferences on it, and all of that may be useful. But perhaps the most important thing is to remember the simplicity. And this is the simple teaching that we give, whether it's to a 6-year-old child or to a 96-year-old person. You can begin to meditate at any stage in your life, of course. What we say to them is this: sit down, sit still. The stillness of body will help to bring you to a stillness of mind. Close your eyes lightly and sit with your back straight so that you can be alert. Be alert and relaxed. It doesn't matter whether you sit on the floor, whether you sit in a chair, whether you sit on a prayer stool. The important thing is to sit still with your back straight and be comfortable. Then closing your eyes lightly so you're not distracted by what's going on around you. Choosing a quiet time and a quiet place as far as possible. You then begin your meditation. And what you do then during this period of meditation, say to begin with for 20 minutes, is to take a single word or short phrase and repeat this continuously in the mind and heart. You could, for example, take the name Jesus or the word Abba. These are very ancient Christian prayer words or mantras, we sometimes call them. In Latin, it was called a formula. The word I would actually recommend, however, is the word Maranatha. Maranatha is the oldest Christian prayer. It means come Lord. It's in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, and St. Paul ends the first letter to the Corinthians with it. So it's a very sacred word in the Christian tradition, and the sound of the word and the length of the word also make it a very suitable prayer word for your meditation. So then you begin to recite or repeat your word silently in your mind, in your heart, and listen to the word as you say it. Articulate the word clearly in your mind, listen to it as you say it, and say it gently, without force. Say it attentively, give it your wholehearted attention. Say it faithfully. In other words, when you get distracted, which we all do, when you get distracted, simply come back to the word and start saying it again. And above all, say it simply, without analyzing what you're doing or expecting anything to happen. And if you can bring that approach to the meditation, you'll find it's a wonderful and enriching prayer of the heart. It doesn't replace other forms of prayer. In fact, it enhances them and enriches them. In my own life as a monk, I found that my reading of scripture, my divine office, my celebration of the Mass, all of these other forms of prayer have been deeply enriched by this contemplative dimension. I think of prayer as a big wheel, and the different spokes of the wheel are like the different forms of prayer. They're all valid, they're all good. You have devotional prayer, the rosary, you have the Mass, you have scripture, you have charismatic prayer, you have Ignatian forms of prayer. And all of these forms and schools of prayer, schools of spirituality, they should never be in conflict with each other. They express different aspects of our journey and relationship to God. But all of these spokes of the wheel converge and meet in the hub of the wheel. And that's where we really understand what meditation means. Because at the hub of the wheel there is simplicity. And there is, in the Christian understanding, the prayer of Christ himself. That in our heart, Christ is praying, and we enter into his prayer. This is why St. Paul says, we do not know how to pray, but the Spirit prays within us. So that's our theology. That's the simple, basic theology of the indwelling Christ and Christ dwelling in us, and that as we leave self behind, we leave even our own prayer behind and enter into a full and life-giving union with him. Meditation is a simple practice, a simple way of prayer that we can build into our daily lives, early morning, early evening. But it has a remarkable transformative effect on every aspect of our life and reveals to us really that our life is a journey to God. When people first begin to meditate, they often feel this is a very private and kind of prayer. It's not really private, but it is personal. And it's a solitary form of prayer in the sense that I can't meditate for you and you can't meditate for me. I can't say to you, look, I'm feeling a bit jet-lagged today, would you mind doing my meditation for me? On the other hand, we can meditate together. And that is really something essentially Christian about meditation, that we naturally are attracted together to meditate in the silence. And that seems to me to be the power of the Spirit, the mystery of Christ building himself up at this deep level of prayer. Now, what do we find then when we come together, sharing our solitude in that sense? We find community. We find that we're able to relate to people at deeper levels. Usually when we meet people, we are a little suspicious of them. We don't know whether we like them. We don't know what their opinions are. We test them out. Sometimes we have our defenses so strong that we never let them down. But in meditation, I think we move beyond those sort of defenses and that sort of fear of the other person, and we find that we can be with them in a trusting, in a tolerant, and in a loving way. So community is a very real part of the Christian life, and it's a very real fruit of our meditation. Now, within a community, as community grows and as it develops, there are many different jobs to do, many different ways of service. Some people talk a lot, like me. Some people, write. Some people publish the books. Some people sell the books. Some people organize events, retreats. Some people send out the newsletter. Some people run the website. Some people teach others. We're a community in which really every kind of work is equally valid, equally sacred. Some people may be more in the limelight than others, but really we are all equal. In a Christian community, there is only one teacher, and the one teacher is Christ. And that's what brings a Christian community together, in equality, in friendship, and in love, to share their gifts. And then, this is a very important aspect, really, of a community. We are sharing the fruits of meditation, the gifts of meditation, with others. Many people who find themselves supported in a meditation community and supported by their daily practice find that they have a work to do in the world. Maybe working with the poor, maybe working for justice, maybe working for the environment. It may be raising a family with a special kind of love and dedication, working with handicapped people. In all of these different ways, I think we express, as a community, through our individuality, we express the love of Christ at work in the world. So we can't all do everything, but together we can do everything. And I think meditation helps us to recognize the specific work of service and of value that we are able to do for the world. Because meditation is universal, and we find it at the heart of all the great religious traditions, it offers us a way into the common ground of our humanity, and a common ground with members of other faiths. It's one of the great challenges of the 21st century is that the great religious traditions need to come together in friendship and collaboration for the well-being of the world. I think we can't solve our huge global crisis without a spiritual consciousness, without a spiritual understanding of what that crisis means and of where we should go from here. And this is not the work of one religion. This has to be a collaborative effort, and the contemplative or spiritual or mystical dimensions of these other religions need to come together in a new way to create that new vision, that new consciousness. So all forms of dialogue are valuable, but I think a dialogue that is connected to the contemplative experience is really fruitful, is really powerful. And that's what we do, especially when we come together, Christians, Muslims and Jews. We know that we have the same God, we have many differences. We sometimes have terrible histories of intolerance and of brutality to each other. Nevertheless, in the 21st century, while not forgetting or denying the past, I think we have to look to the future. We have to look towards a world in which religions are able to respect their differences, even celebrate their differences, but transcend their divisions. It's possible, I think, through meditation. Meditation is a way of faith, pure faith. You may have Christian faith, you may have Muslim faith, you may have Jewish faith or Buddhist faith, but faith itself is our commitment to the truth, to relationship, to love. So the heart of meditation is this development of the way of faith. Then we have beliefs. At the way of faith level, we can really experience community. We can experience that we are one. In the level of the level of belief, of course there are differences. And those differences need not be divisions, but we cannot translate one religion into another. There are parallels and resonances, but not total equivalence. So it is possible for us to meditate with members of other faiths and to taste what for us as Christians we know to be the spirit of unity, the Spirit of God, uniting us and working in us for God's own purpose. We don't know what that purpose of unity is going to look like or what it's going to be, but our work is to serve it and encourage it to the best of our ability. So interreligious dialogue, coming out of this experience of meditation, is, I think, one of the most hopeful signs in our modern world. So why did meditation disappear from the center of Christian life, and why have we recovered it in recent times? I think it disappeared from the center partly because of a split between theology and experience, that our thinking about God became disconnected from our experience of God. Also, at the time of the Reformation, there was a suspicion of contemplation, both on the part of Catholics and of Protestants, although for different reasons. And so contemplation became marginalized. It was seen as a speciality, and even something to be rather suspect about. I've met Catholic priests who said that they were told in the seminary that they shouldn't even consider exploring the contemplative prayer. So this is a sad aberration. It's a sad fault in our Christian history. But from the time of about the Second Vatican Council, may go back earlier, this fault was being corrected. We were discovering that meditation does belong to the center of Christian life. Contemplation is at the heart of the gospel. This rediscovery of the contemplative dimension of the gospel, of scripture, and of prayer became a great awakening, and it spread out throughout the church. I've traveled all around the world. Our community is present in more than 100 countries, and wherever I go, different cultures, different kinds of people, different levels of faith, but there is a hunger and a great desire for contemplation. And meditation is the simplest way that we can respond to that hunger. God's kingdom before everything else, and everything else will come to you as well. Mindfulness means attention, paying attention, that specific attention of the heart, which really is the essence of all prayer. And finally, in this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us to live in the present moment. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't be living in tomorrow. Live now. And if you put all of these elements of Jesus' teaching on prayer together, you have a teaching on contemplation. And I think it's very clear. Jesus is a teacher of contemplation. These are all very valid and helpful ways of prayer. But there's another dimension of prayer which we call the prayer of the heart. In these other forms of prayer, where we're using words and thoughts or imagination or rituals, we are still, to some degree, still at the level of the mind. But in meditation, we move from the mind to the heart by letting go of thoughts. This tradition in Christianity goes back, I think, to the teaching of Jesus himself on prayer. He tells us, when you pray, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your office. Do not worry. Lay aside your anxieties, your worries, he says. Look at the birds of the air, the lilies of the field, and contemplate the beauty of nature rather than just be constantly worrying about what we don't have. And I think here this is a challenging teaching on prayer, because he's asking us to lay aside the very things that our minds are usually preoccupied with. That's our thoughts of the past, our thoughts of the future, our anxieties, our fears, or our desires. But again, the teaching is very clear. Then he tells us, be mindful. Set your mind on God Father, who is in that secret place. So he stresses the the importance of interiority, the heart. And then he tells us, when you pray, do not go babbling on like the heathen, who think the more they say, the more likely they are to be heard, because God knows your needs before you ask. So here he's telling us that we don't need to speak all the time. We don't need to use too many words. We can trust that God knows us and our needs are held in God's love. So here we can see a teaching on silence and on the value of silence. Then he tells us meditation is a universal spiritual wisdom. We find it in all the great religious traditions, and of course it belongs within the Christian tradition as well. We call it contemplation, we call it the prayer of the heart. In the way most of us were introduced to prayer, we were introduced to mental prayer or devotional prayer, or perhaps the prayer of the sacraments, the Mass, and so on.